Scott. Oh my God. Shut him. Yeah. Leave this one open. Holy shit. You gotta get ready to throw this inside. Look at the smoke coming out of the street. Oh my.
Seated, please. Good morning and welcome to the White House. Today we take an essential step in defeating terrorism while protecting the constitutional rights of all Americans. With my signature, this law will give intelligence and law enforcement officials important new tools to fight a present danger. I commend the House and Senate for the hard work they put into this legislation. Members of Congress and their staffs spent long nights and weekends to get this important bill to my desk. I appreciate their efforts and bipartisanship in passing this new law. I want to thank the Director of the FBI and the Director of the CIA for waging an incredibly important part on the two-front war, one overseas and a front here at home. On the two-front war, one overseas and a front here at home. Intelligence operations and criminal investigations, the chance to operate not on separate tracks, but to share vital information so necessary to disrupt a terrorist attack before it occurs. As of today, we're changing the laws governing information sharing. And as importantly, we're changing the culture of our various agencies that fight terrorism. As of today, we're changing the laws governing information sharing.
You can have all the intelligence data you want, but if it does not get to the right people, what good is it? That's the logic behind what are called fusion centers. Basically, they are a way for government agencies to connect the dots and try to prevent another 9/11. Correspondent Lori Engel has the story.
In this unassuming office in Des Moines, Iowa, federal, state, county, and city law enforcement agents are all gathered under one roof in what has become a model of intelligence sharing.
Countering and investigating terrorist activity is the #1 priority for both law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Surveillance of communications is another essential tool to pursue and stop terrorists.
48 states now have fusion centers based on an agency Iowa created in 1984. Iowa Director Russell Porter helped craft the idea to fill in the gaps of intelligence gathering that were discovered after the September 11th attacks.
I think what we see today, even more so than what we saw then, is that this is really a global issue.
This new law that I signed today will allow surveillance of all communications used by terrorists, including emails, the internet, and cell phones.
The scathing 141-page Senate Subcommittee on Investigations report blasts the country's 77 fusion centers, originally created after 9/11 to help the federal government share information with state and local partners.
The fusion centers then become the entity uniquely positioned to help us better protect communities from all threats, from terrorism, from other types of criminal plots, and other threats to community.
This bill met with overwhelming agreement in Congress because it upholds and respects the civil liberties guaranteed by our Constitution.
They're collecting all kinds of data on us. The NSA is collecting data. They're militarizing the police.
The fusion centers. The fusion centers as well.
What are the fusion centers? I don't know if I know what fusion centers are.
They're in every state. And every state capital has a fusion center. And what that fusion center is responsible for is the collation of local data about citizens. And it's forwarded to the national database. Google it. Dear God, tell your audience to Google it. They need to understand what they're up against.
And so I did Google it, and so did Pat and Stu, and so now we probably lit up the boards on these fusion centers so they could come pick us up later. I don't know.
This legislation is essential not only to pursuing and punishing terrorists, but also preventing more atrocities in the hands of the evil ones. This government will enforce this law with all the urgency of a nation at war.
I mean, we have built a cage for Americans. What's a fusion center?
Glenn, I used to work essentially in what was a fusion center, so I'm pretty familiar with them. The idea is in a post 9/11 world, you need to have full spectrum and data sharing. So that means that local law enforcement is picking up all kinds of stuff over the course of their investigations, and also just things that come up in the course of their doing business, not necessarily with any criminal predicate. And then they bring that data together with people who work at the federal agencies. They sit next to people who work at the federal agencies in these fusion centers.
Okay,
the
so
idea being that maybe
this was because we have to tear down these walls and we have to talk to each other, et cetera, et cetera. So is it a bad place or a good place? What the hell? Don't give me anything else to worry about.
I think it's a pretty bad place. For one, you have fusion centers in places that have never suffered a terrorist attack, that are very unlikely to suffer a terrorist attack, and quite honestly, the fusion center in those places probably wouldn't be able to prevent a terrorist attack anyway if one were to happen. So you have them in all these states. A lot of it has to do with the money, the federal funding that comes, particularly from the Department of Homeland Security, gives grants to places so that they can they get this money. Sometimes they use it for very strange purposes. I know of cases where terrorism funds have more or less been used to track livestock, but that's a discussion for another time. I mean, Glenn, the truth is that whenever you have local cops sitting next to federal officers and there's a free and open sharing of information between them, guess what? What can be picked up over the course of perhaps the early stages of a terrorism investigation can very easily be passed up or down, depending whether you're going up to the federal or down from the federal to the local. And now you've got people who are essentially getting caught up in criminal actions based upon the investigations of these fusion centers themselves. So there is a problem for privacy, for civil liberties, and for just how wide spectrum these centers are.
You can do something.
doesn't mean you should.
Ben Stone, executive director with the American Civil Liberties Union in Iowa, says his concern isn't so much with the main mission of fusion centers, but with how the information is gathered and that there is no political oversight.
There's been history in America of abuse by the intelligence community, by the FBI, of American citizens' rights and their privacy. And we need to learn from history, not repeat it.
Remember when the president said we have to have a home security force, a homeland security force just as prepared, just as well funded, and just as well armed as our U.S. military?
We cannot continue to rely only on our military in order to achieve the national security objectives that we've set. We've got to have a civilian national security force that's just as powerful, just as strong, just as well funded.
Are building a militarized police force, Glenn. They are essentially blurring any distinction between federal law enforcement and local law enforcement, which should be very clear lanes in the road for everyone to understand. And this can be turned into a turnkey tyranny very quickly.
Intelligence gathering, we run the risk of taking a step back in time, back to the days before 9/11.
It is now my honor to sign into law the USA PATRIOT Act of 2001.
Government Republicans and Democrats were busy shredding the last vestiges of the Constitution. They're talking about inserting the Army into domestic law enforcement. Senator Lindsey Graham, who supports this bill, says, quote, "The homeland is part of the battlefield, and people can be held without trial, whether an American citizen or not."
Turn now to that secret document, 16 pages long and stirring up so much controversy tonight. It is a kind of handbook for lethal power against terrorists, even if they are American citizens. ABC's chief White House correspondent Jonathan Karl tells us about the news today.
By one count, President Obama has already used unmanned CIA drones to strike more than 300 suspected terrorist targets, even more than his predecessor. But today we learned just how much authority the administration believes it has to kill without trial or evidence suspected terrorists, even American citizens. A newly disclosed Justice Department document says American citizens tied to al-Qaeda can be killed if, quote, an informed high-level official believes the target poses an imminent threat. But the document says it, quote, does not require the government to have clear evidence.
The Senate will pass tomorrow a bill allowing the American military to imprison American citizens indefinitely without charge or trial. How bad is this?
It's quite frankly absurd, Keith. I mean, here we are 10 years after 9/11, in the wake of the demise of Osama bin Laden, the only leader that al-Qaeda has ever known. And we're passing a provision that would codify the indefinite detention without trial of suspected enemies of the state. And that includes, as you mentioned, American citizens apprehended here on U.S. soil.
Look at this line of riot police here on Central right now. We've got a staggered line of riot police, a front line here. We have another line of riot police here, tactical units, as I showed you behind. And if you look beyond, I don't know if you can see, there are mounted riot police as well standing by. This may look a little bit unusual to you.
The protest started at noon yesterday. Protesters walked down Central on the highway and were met by officers in riot gear. Police used tear gas twice. Says it was after repeated warnings for people to disperse that officers then released tear gas. At one point, protesters also converged on I-25 and started laying down in the middle of traffic.
Many people who lived or worked near the protest say at times it got downright scary.
It's going to look like for Americans on the internet 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Because this is going to happen, what, in 2015 when the contract's up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I worry about censorship to go off of what Anna's asking here. This idea that the government right now could be limiting or further limiting what we surf and what we have access to.
3 years after the big bank bailout, secrets are emerging, including the one about the $13 billion in profits the banks made thanks to below-market loan rates from the Federal Reserve. Our fourth story on the countdown, a kind of smoking gun proving your worst fears about the 2008 public welfare checks from taxpayers to banks who described themselves as too big to fail. It was called income redistribution. In its new issue, Bloomberg Markets Magazine reporting how the banks used secrecy and opportunism to get bigger, richer, and more powerful while citizens lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. No wonder the Fed and the banks kept the details secret until Bloomberg reporters and editors pried loose 29,000 pages of documents via a Freedom of Information request. Let's flash back to this exchange from January 2009, when then Congressman Alan Grayson of Florida grilled Donald Cohn, then the vice chairman of the Fed. Grayson will join us in a moment, wanted to know what banks got what loans and for how much, and Cohn ducked the question and implied it was none of Grayson's business, nor the public's.
And you're saying that that entitles you to keep secret the expenditure of $1.2 trillion, $4,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country?
I don't think we're keeping it secret. I think we're releasing a lot of information about it, but I would personally, I would personally be very, very reluctant to release the individual names of the borrowers.
What do you think might happen if people knew how their $1.2 trillion had been spent? Do you think they might be angry?
No, I don't know, obviously. I think that they can judge how the money is spent from how the money is lent from what we're telling them.
And what if the public was told more? Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio suggesting Congress would have been less generous. He told that Bloomberg magazine, this is an issue that can unite the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. There are lawmakers in both parties who would change their votes now.
And get a full and complete audit of the Federal Reserve, which has now shown $16 trillion in money lent out directly from the Federal Reserve to institutions, various institutions, including many foreign institutions. About a third of the money, it turns out, went to foreign institutions. And then on top of that, another $10 trillion in currency swaps between the Federal Reserve and foreign central banks, which they had no way to recover if the foreign central banks weren't able to get the money back themselves. So altogether, $26 trillion of bailouts just in those two categories, not including TARP, not including FDIC financing of U.S. institutions. $26 trillion, that's almost $100,000 for every man, woman, and child in America, all done by the Federal Reserve without any act of Congress authorizing it.
Let's say the United States needs money. Instead of issuing their own United States notes backed by their own credit, they issue treasury bonds. They then sell these bonds to the Federal Reserve, which buys them with money they created out of thin air. The money that the Fed created then goes to the U.S. The U.S. then pays interest on the money that the Fed lent to the Treasury. So to clarify, the Fed creates money from nothing, loans that money to the U.S., and then charges interest on that money. What this means is that there is never and will never be enough money in circulation or in existence to pay back that debt. We as a country, as well as private citizens, are forever enslaved by debt with no way of ever paying it off. Now, when the Federal Reserve buys bonds on Wall Street, the major financial firms that have been selected as dealers deposit the proceeds at their own banks. Fed rules require banks to keep 10% of their deposits in reserves, but the bank is free to issue loans equal to the remaining 90%. Let's say the Federal Reserve buys a $1,000 bond. After putting away 10% into their reserves, they are then able to loan out 90%, or $900. Since the original $1,000 is still on deposit, the $900 in loan proceeds is more new money, money created out of nothing. A total of $1,900 of new money is now available in the economy. Now the person that took the $900 loan spends that money. The payee then deposits the $900 into their bank account, and once again, reserves and deposits increase. This process goes on until that original $1,000 bond, which was created from nothing, becomes $10,000, making this one full-fledged debt machine while also devaluing the dollar. The more money that is out in the economy, the more the value decreases. There's no wonder that since the implementation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the dollar has lost over 95% of its value. The US dollar will eventually be destroyed due to an overwhelming financial crisis, and a globalist-run monetary authority will come along to save the day. And much like the Fed pretends that its goal is to prevent another Great Depression, the global currency will pledge to prevent another financial crisis, thus putting more power into the hands of a few and enslaving humanity that much more.
A lot of numbers thrown around here, and sometimes when you just hear it abstractly, 13 billion sounds like it's larger than 7 trillion. Which of all of these numbers, which outrages you the most and which should outrage the public the most?
I think that we can all agree the trillions of dollars that were extended by the Federal Reserve to the banks in the form of corporate welfare. What they did is they took our money, the US dollar, the fact that they control the currency, the fact that they have control of the money supply, and for the first time in history, and I'm talking about in the 100-year history of the Federal Reserve, they played favorites. They said, we'll give 100 trillion to this institution, 100 billion to this institution, another 100 billion to this institution, and so on down the line, when you and I couldn't even come close to accessing that kind of money on those terms.
In gold. That is a tremendous loss of purchasing power. The Dow has lost better than 60% of its value since its peak in 2000.
Sounds like good management to me. Sounds like good management of the economy to me. It's
describe the U.S. market as being bulletproof, and I think gold is telling us that it's about to get shot full of holes here. The housing market is just beginning to unravel. We're seeing the tip of the iceberg here in the mortgage sector, but probably...
How do you put together all this gloom and doom? What data tells you this, Peter?
The other guest here, the whole concept of this U.S. economy is teetering on recession, with all due respect, I think is absurd.
Money, the value of their wages and their savings diminished.
I don't think that has any impact. The Fed doesn't have any impact on that at all.
Of course it does.
Their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours the world economy would have collapsed.
Was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
This time, the Dow Jones Industrial Average passed the 13,000 mark.
Another milestone for the market, 14,000 on the money.
Record-breaking kickoff to the fourth quarter as the Dow Jones Industrial Average closes at a new all-time record high.
The closing numbers on the markets today, at one point the market fell as if down a well over 700 points.
Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%. We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%. The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Almost everything there completely wiped out. And the NASDAQ, everything and more has been completely wiped out.
The Dow traders are standing there watching in amazement. I don't blame them.
Working the phone say a lot of their customers are freaked out, waiting to see how low the Dow will go.
Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank.
What started in America last year has now spread to every part of the world.
America's Federal Reserve and a consortium of 10 international banks have announced emergency plans to calm the stock market.
Congress knows nothing of the conversations, the plans, and the action taken in concert with other central banks.
Cicero was right.
We're in the last days of this country surviving.
Steve Leisman, Treasury runs the printing presses to print the dollars. Some of the dollars go into the Fed. Fed takes the dollars, buys Treasury bonds that the Treasury issues to raise money. Money goes back into the Fed. Isn't this all kind of one big Ponzi scheme?
Sophisticated term for that, Dennis. We call it monetizing the debt.
Will the Federal Reserve monetize this debt? The Federal Reserve will not monetize the debt.
The dollar today is worth only 4 cents compared to the dollar that the Federal Reserve started with.
He was the Special Inspector General in charge of overseeing the Troubled Assets Relief Program, otherwise known as TARP.
All paper currencies are vulnerable to collapse, and history is replete with examples of great suffering caused by these collapses, especially to the nation's poor and the middle class.
I was a lifelong Democrat. I even contributed to then Senator Obama's presidential campaign, but I was actually appointed by President Bush, Republican, and it was sort of striking to me as a lifelong Democrat of how little things had changed.
So my question to you is, will you tell the American people to whom you lent $2.2 trillion of their dollars? Will you tell us who got that money and what the terms are of those agreements?
Who was managing the U.S. economy, the government or the banks?
Even before a currency collapses, the damage done by a fiat system is significant. Our monetary system insidiously transfers wealth from the poor and the middle class to the privileged rich.
They gave it to the banks. No strings attached, no conditions, no requirements, no incentives, no transparency.
Wages never keep up with profits on Wall Street and the banks, thus sowing the seeds of class and discontent. When economic trouble hits, free markets and free trade are often blamed, while the harmful effects of a fiat monetary system are ignored.
I'd like to go to the question about too big to fail. That we haven't gotten rid of it yet. And so now we have a double problem, and that is that the big banks, big at the time that they were bailed out the first time, have gotten bigger.
Give the money to the banks and trust them. And of course, what happened? The banks didn't use the money for lending. They hoarded it. They lent it back to the government. They invested it. They did whatever they could to maximize their profits. They did almost everything other than increase lending, and lending actually contracted. So that's sort of an example of where the government had an incredible amount of control and leverage and chose not to use it.
We've now understood this problem for nearly 5 years. So when are we going to get rid of too big to fail?
Well, some of the, as we've been discussing, some of these rules take time to develop.
The official storyline, the official narrative, which survives to this day, is that TARP worked. TARP was incredibly successful because it helped preserve the financial system. But that's not what TARP was supposed to do.
I'm just pointing out that in all that space in between, what's happening is the big banks are getting a terrific break, and the little banks are just getting smashed on this. They're not getting that kind of break. And that has long-term impact for all of the financial system.
I agree with you 100%.
Thank you.
We look at GDP figures and reassure ourselves that all is well, yet a growing number of Americans still do not enjoy the high standard of living that monetary inflation brings to the privileged few. Those who benefit the most are the ones who get to use the newly created credit first.
Is Treasury aware of who the counterparties were that were going to receive payment in full on the credit default swaps when $170 billion went to AI?
They have hundreds and thousands, maybe thousands of counterparties, but I'm sure that the supervisors involved and the people at the Fed who were at the front lines of this stuff would have access to detailed information.
So they knew who was going to get the money, the counterparties.
Well, I think they could have known.
But it's not like sort of just the traditional way we think of the way that any large corporations or powerful corporations have influence in Washington. When we typically say that, we think about the money and the campaign contributions and the lobbying, and all of that is totally valid. But what I saw was far different, and frankly, far more insidious, and to me much more damaging and dangerous. It was more of the complete ideological capture of these individuals. And
government officials consistently claim that inflation is in check at barely 2%, but middle-class Americans know that their purchasing power, especially when it comes to housing, energy, and medical care and school tuition, is shrinking much faster than at 2% per year.
We know that one of today's witnesses made the decision to pay AIG counterparties at 100 cents on the dollar. We know that one of today's witnesses was the primary architect of the AIG trust agreement, whereby the taxpayers' investment in AIG is managed not in the interest of the U.S. taxpayers, but of the United States Treasury Department.
Were you involved in any discussions with AIG or your staff involved where you discussed what AIG should or should not disclose to the public?
Mr. Chairman, as I said, I had no role in making those decisions.
The last crisis cost $13 trillion. One can only imagine what will happen next time.
And Chrysler and GM, insolvent company, AIG, insolvent company.
History was eventually rewritten by the Treasury Department to make it seem like TARP, all it was ever supposed to do was put this Band-Aid over a broken financial system, and all those other things for which there would never have been a bank bailout, all those things that are supposed to help people other than the executives at the giant financial institutions, well, that just got ignored and sort of brushed away.
Chrysler and GM have bondholders, unsecured creditors, secured creditors, and employees, and they all took big haircuts. AIG had people holding credit default swaps, and they took no haircut at all. They ended up with money from the federal government 100 cents on the dollar.
And one of the biggest costs, which we've not yet realized, in the way the bailouts were conducted, is that we put essentially a Band-Aid over a gaping chest wound.
A year ago, we were worried about banks that were too big to fail, but in the last year, big banks have gotten bigger.
Talking about an entire year's worth of GDP, or the entire production of the entire American economy, wiped out.
The only way they can pass this bill is by creating and sustaining a panic atmosphere. That atmosphere is not justified. Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no.
And we have the same type of broken financial system that we did in 2008, only with banks that are more concentrated, more powerful, and more dangerous. But if left undisturbed, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, or 8 years, it's going to happen again. It's just sort of naive to look at all the incentives and all the things that are still in the system that caused crisis before and presume that for some magical reason they won't happen again. You know, we could be looking at a crisis that will make the last one look almost pedestrian.
It's pretty bad right now. How much worse would it have to get?
You know, I don't know. And you know, we saw glimpses in the Occupy Wall Street movement. We saw glimpses in the Tea Party movement, you know, which was originally about the unfairness of the bailouts. It was what, you know, triggered a lot of the Tea Party anger. But we also saw those movements, they've transformed. So I think there's a lot of anger out there still, but it hasn't found a place to be channeled. And but look, I think if we continue to go down this path, it's almost inevitable that it'll once again erupt. And the question is, what is that trigger going to be? And can it turn into something more than a bunch of angry people yelling and into a significant political movement?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Inspector Coleman, you're the Inspector General for the Federal Reserve, right? Okay.
That's correct.
Have you done any investigations concerning the Federal Reserve's role in deciding not to save Lehman Brothers, which led to shockwaves that went through the entire financial system?
In that particular area, I don't generally comment on specific investigations, but we do not currently have an investigation in that particular area.
All right. What about the $1 trillion plus in expansion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet since last September? Have you conducted any investigations regarding that?
Right now we have a, we call it a review, and I don't know if the term investigation may have different connotations. So we're actually conducting a fairly high-level review of the various lending facilities collectively, which would include, the TALF, a variety of the different programs that are in process. So we're looking at them at a fairly high level to identify risk.
Well, I understand that, but we're talking about events that started unfolding 8 months ago. Have you reached any conclusions about the Fed expanding its balance sheet by over $1 trillion since last September?
We have not yet reached any conclusions.
Do you know who received that money?
For the, we're in the process right now of doing our review, and
right, but you're the Inspector General. My question to you specifically is, do you know who received that $1 trillion plus that the Fed extended and put on its balance sheet since last September? Do you know the identity of the recipients?
I do not know. We have not looked at that specific area at this particular point on those reviews.
What about Bloomberg's report that there are trillions of dollars in off-balance sheets transactions that the Federal Reserve has entered into since last September? Are you familiar with those off-balance sheet transactions?
I think it may be important at this point, too, just to bring up a certain aspect related to our jurisdiction. And just to clarify perhaps some of my earlier comments. We are the Inspector General for the Board of Governors, and we have direct oversight over board programs and operations, and are also able to look at board delegated functions to the reserve banks, as well as the board's oversight and supervision of the reserve banks. We do not have jurisdiction to directly go out and audit reserve bank activities specifically. Nevertheless, in our lending facilities project, for example, we are looking at the board's oversight over the program, and to the extent that extends out to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Well, I have a copy of the Inspector General Act here in front of me, and it says, among other things, that it's your responsibility to conduct and supervise audits and investigations relating to the programs and operations of your agency.
That's correct.
So I'm asking you if your agency has, in fact, according to Bloomberg, extended $9 trillion in credit, which, by the way, works out to $30,000 for every single man, woman, and child in this country. I'd like to know, if you're not responsible for investigating that, who is?
We have responsibility for the Federal Reserve's programs and operations, audits, to conduct audits and investigations in that area. In terms of who's responsible for investigating, would you mind repeating the question one more time?
What have you done to investigate the off-balance sheet transactions conducted by the Federal Reserve, which, according to Bloomberg, now total $9 trillion in the last 8 months?
I'll have to look specifically at that Bloomberg article. I'm not, I don't know if I have actually seen that particular one.
That's not the point. The question is, have you done any investigation or auditing of off-balance sheet transactions conducted by the Federal Reserve?
At this point, we're conducting our lending facility project at a fairly high level and have not gotten to a specific level of detail to really be in a position to respond your question.
Have you conducted any investigation or auditing of the losses that the Federal Reserve has experienced on its lending since last September?
We're still in the process of conducting that review. Until we actually, go out and gather the information, I'm not in a position to really respond to the specific question.
So are you telling me that nobody at the Federal Reserve is keeping track on a regular basis of the losses that it incurs on what is now a $2 trillion portfolio?
I don't know if you're telling me that you're mentioning that there's losses. I'm just saying that we're not, until we actually look at the program and have the information, we are not in a position to say whether there are losses or to respond in any other way to that particular.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I have to tell you honestly, I am shocked to find out that nobody at the Federal Reserve, including the Inspector General, is keeping track of this.
Good evening, everybody. President Obama and British Prime Minister Gordon today calling for a new world order to tackle our global economic crisis.
Chair, so appeared to be injured in some way. We didn't see blood on that person.
So there were people that did see people holding guns and firing them. Everybody was dressed in plain clothes initially, and by the time we got out of the terminal, we don't know what happened after that.
Let me ask you this. You saw plainclothes people holding guns. Is that right?
I did not specifically see them, but other people that were with did.
I see. And did you hear anything or see anything about the gunman? Was there one gunman, or did you hear there were more than one?
I really don't know. I really don't know.
So appeared to be injured in some way. We didn't see blood on that person.
The screening area, I was putting all of my belongings in the tray. I had one boot off, and I put my boot in the tray, and all of a sudden we heard the shots, and we just all fell to the floor and on top of each other, and it was like a dream. It wasn't real. It was like a movie. It was so intense, and it scared. I don't know if we're still safe.
What you do see today, according to investigators, is he walks into the terminal, he's got the gun in a garment bag, he takes the rifle out, he opens fire, shoots his way through the checkpoint, going down a side, coming around the back, and he's focused on the TSA agents. Inside the bag, we are told investigators came up with notes saying that the TSA were fascists and pigs, anti-American rantings, anti-TSA rantings, and references to the New World Order.
President Obama today proposed something new, something called prolonged detention.
Police brutality running wild in New York. Americans dragged, punched, and pepper sprayed.
Woman on the ground screaming, crying after getting assaulted brutally by police.
Over 80 people were arrested over the weekend at peaceful anti-Wall Street protests. Among them, Eric, beaten up and held for 36 hours. The deep scars on his hands speak for themselves. The activist is shocked by the price Americans are paying for speaking out about injustice.
Putting somebody in jail not for what they've done, but for what you're very sure they're going to do?
There may be a number of people who cannot be prosecuted for past crimes. In some cases because evidence may be tainted, but who nonetheless pose a threat to the security of the United States.
We're not prosecuting them for past crimes, but we need to keep them in prison because of our expectation of their future crimes. persecuting them for past crimes, but we need to keep them in prison because of our expectation of their future crimes.
I stand here as a free American.
You are?
I spent 5 years under the assault of the U.S. government because I simply spoke truth to power. As an NSA whistleblower, I exposed and disclosed high crimes and misdemeanors that were actually committed by the U.S. government up to and including the White House. Secret surveillance, warrantless wiretapping, massive fraud, waste, and abuse, billions and billions of dollars being wasted of U.S. taxpayer money.
Well, it's a bill that has received very little attention but may make free speech a felony and seriously restrict your right to political protest. Just signed into law by the president, H.R. 347 gives federal agents sweeping powers to arrest and bring felony charges against citizens engaged in protests.
So is the long tradition of protesting in America being threatened?
Incarcerate people preventively. Preventive incarceration. Indefinite detention without trial. That's what this is.
Against the final assault by this administration, which has been continuing from the previous administration since 2001.
Police response has been overly violent and brutal. They maced 5 women. They collected them around a net and then maced them, and they weren't even warned. The captain stepped up, maced their faces, and then tried to run away and avoid cameras that were around.
Police have blocked out this corner over here, preventing any kind of exit. They've blocked out this exit. They've blocked out this exit. These people really don't have anywhere where they can go. And the police are running into the crowd and hitting people with batons and pointing guns at them. Right here we got some police pointing weapons at the crowd who's blocked in. They have nowhere to go.
Since the start of the movement, nationwide protests have faced numerous cases of police crackdowns with batons and tear gas often used to break up crowds. As the movement continues, so does Washington's desire to silence the U.S. public, according to RT's Marina Portnaya in this report.
She's a journalist!
It's a country that extols the virtues of liberty unlike no other. A police offensive aimed at crushing Occupy Wall Street has succeeded in shattering America's globally marketed brand of freedom. In America, it is a criminal offense to exercise freedom of speech at events deemed nationally significant, such as presidential conventions and debates. Protesting in areas where the U.S. president or anyone protected by the Secret Service may be visiting is considered a felony, punishable with hefty fines and up to 10 years in jail. The Federal Restricted Buildings and Grounds Improvement Act, known as H.R. 347, is a law most Americans don't know about. But you don't have to do a lot
to feel its force. A new reality where it's feared that just about any American engaging in political protests can be prosecuted. While U.S. leaders can't resolve issues like national debt and homelessness, they're all on the same page when it comes to how to handle all those citizens flooding the streets to demand change and accountability.
Under the excuse that somehow we live in exigent conditions, and it's somehow because these conditions are so different and so extraordinary that the Constitution is just a mere piece of paper and it's not worth what it was written on.
What's he say? What's he say? Hey, man!
An oath to immediately.
What all these police, there's got to be a couple hundred officers here. Oh man, okay, we got flash things going off over here. They're running into the crowd and hitting people with batons.
I can't move any faster. Whoa, easy.
Watch your back. Already started something. Out of the way. Move out of the way. Yeah, man, don't push me. Back it up. Push it. Back it up. There's a fence, officers. There's a fence. Do something. Why are you hitting me? I can't move, cocksucker. That's my neck, cocksucker. We can't. You're on film pushing me in the neck, cocksucker. If you're pushing us, I'll film over here. I'm pushed against it. I can't get off the fence. We're pinned against the fucking fence, officer. Safe tonight. I think the real threat to public safety here is the police more than this crowd.
I mean, these people aren't doing anything other than trying to protest. Protesters are backing off, trying to find somewhere else to go. But like I said, this corner blocked by police, not allowed to exit down there. This side, they're blocked by police. Now they've formed a whole line across this whole end. It looks like they're just going to slowly march in and squeeze this crowd down until they have nowhere left to go. Protesters now, after all this, you know, really have nowhere left to go but through the fence. So there goes the fence. Hope no one gets hurt. Looks like there's almost a stampede here.
You see it, baby. They don't lie.
Let's go.
They don't lie. They don't lie. They don't lie, tough guy. This is not a war zone. This is not a war zone. These are unarmed people. It doesn't make you tough to hurt these people. It doesn't make you tough to hurt these people. It doesn't. I don't care. I don't care about these people. I put in my work. It doesn't lie. It does not make you tough to hurt these people. There's nothing tough about it. Nothing. If you want to go fight, go to Iraq and Afghanistan. But you want to be here hurting U.S. citizens. Where is that in the contract? Where is that in the contract? Leave these people alone. They're U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens. U.S. It does not make you tough to do this to them. It doesn't. Stop hurting these people, man. Why y'all do this to our people? I've been to Iraq 14 months for my people. You come over here and hurt them. They don't have guns. They don't have guns. They don't. Why are you hurting these people? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. How do you sleep at night? There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this, man. There's no honor in this shit. There is no honor in this shit. There is no honor in what you're doing to these people. No honor. How do you do this to people? How do you do this to people? How do you sleep at night doing this to people? Come on, sir. Keep moving. How do you do this to people? Let's go. How? You're here to protect them. You're here to protect us. Protect us. Why are you hurting U.S. citizens? This is the United States of America. Why are you hurting people? Y'all walk around in riot gear like this is a war. These people don't have guns.
It's a little crazy. Back down.
How can I not act crazy when y'all are hurting people that are protected?
Back up.
My whole family protected this country. I understand, but I'm not out here trying to hurt these people. I'm not walking around trying to hurt them.
But your history doesn't. Who's in Iraq with you?
So why do you allow this? Why are they walking around trying to hurt people?
Let's go, folks. Keep walking.
Please, I'm asking a nice this walk down the block, please. And I can't speak. Y'all want to shut me up. Y'all want to shut me up. There is no honor in hurting unarmed civilians. You get no respect.
What did you see tonight that bothered you?
I was here on October 5th. I saw them beating people, people that had nothing to do with anything, just grabbing people out the crowd. There's no honor in that. My mom, my father, everybody has served in Iraq, Afghanistan. Well, I did 14 months in Iraq. My father was in Afghanistan. My mother did a year in Iraq. We fought for this country. I don't come home. I'm in New York City. I am from New York City, and these cops are hurting people that I fought to protect. There's no reason for this. There's no honor in hurting unarmed civilians, and I won't let it happen. Have a good night.
What's your name?
New York, Sergeant Shamar Thomas. New York. Hey, Mr. President! Huh? Oh, I don't know what they're doing. They walked away. They're scared. Hurrah, hurrah. Crazy. Yes, I am. Shut up, son. All around. Did you see that? Get up. Get up. We will not be silent. HR 347. Across this country. Seeking to silence the people. Take from your mouth. Their voice be heard. The people must smash it. 347 is ashes. The people must smash it. 347 is ashes. The people must smash it. 347 is ashes. The people must smash it. Fight check. Fight check. Fight check. Fight check. House Resolution 347. Another nail. Is another nail. In the coffin of the First Amendment. In the coffin of the First Amendment. It criminalizes protest. It criminalizes protest. It shields the president from criticism. It shields the president from criticism. It makes it illegal to protest. It makes it illegal to protest. Anywhere near. Anywhere near. Any of the four presidential candidates. Any of the four presidential candidates. Legalize patriotism. Legalize patriotism. Legalize protest. Legalize protest. Legalize democracy. Legalize democracy. 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 Fight check. Fight check. For citizens to protest. It's fundamental. It's fundamental. To the continued existence. To the continued existence. Of democracy in America. Of democracy in America. It should not be a crime. It should not be a crime. To criticize our leaders. To criticize our leaders. Step by step. Step by step. Bit by bit. Bit by bit. Our rights are disappearing. Our rights are disappearing. Obama has authorized. Obama has authorized. Domestic surveillance drones. Domestic surveillance drones. Obama has authorized. Obama has authorized. Indefinite detention of Americans. Indefinite detention of Americans. Obama. Obama. Wants to be shielded. Wants to be shielded. By law. By law. From the truth. From the truth. We are here. To resist. To resist. Justice. Justice. Insist. All of us resist. That all of us resist. Justice exists. 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 That all of us resist.
As President Obama made his way onto the stage to pay tribute to Nelson Mandela, he extended his hand to Cuba's communist leader Raul Castro, who shook it and smiled back.
What would you like?
I just want to know, did Treasury have conversations with any of the counterparties who ultimately profited?
NSA is nearing completion on a gargantuan new project. It's named the Utah Data Center. Capable of storing 5 zettabytes of data, or enough to store every email, cell phone call, Google search and surveillance camera video in America for a very long time.